for those of you who just joined, once again, I'm Sue Ostap with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and thanks for joining us today. And this is the third in our series of webinars from a newish project on ending mass incarceration, centralizing racial justice, and developing alternatives, the role of anti-domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Before I go any further, I really want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their support of this webinar and of this amazing project. As you know, today's webinar is titled Dancing the Carceral Creep. You can see it there on the front page. And so in an effort to save time, I just want to do a very brief introduction of Mimi. And you can read her full bio there, although she's done way more than it says on that particular page there. I think you can see from the slide here, she's done a lot of really interesting and just extremely important work and has done so for a long time. And she's done so also with a number of very innovative organizations, including the one that she founded in 2004 called Creative Intervention, which promotes community-based interventions to DV and SA. And for many years now, Mimi has figured out a way of being both a kick-butt activist and a scholar at the same time. And as you know, that is not an easy feat. She's currently an assistant professor of social work at California State University, Long Beach. And even while being a professor, she continues to do a ton of work with community-based organizations in California and around the world on how to implement alternative community-based interventions and transformative justice approaches. So it's really an honor to get to work with Mimi, and it's really been just great to have an opportunity to work more closely with her over the last couple of months, and I really want to welcome her to this webinar. And Mimi, I just really appreciate your work, and I really appreciate your willingness to share it with us today. I also encourage you to go to the Google Drive to the copies of the handouts, which includes a paper that Mimi wrote on today's topic of dancing the carceral creep. Again, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I'll be collecting them for Mimi at the end of the presentation, and I will ask as many as I can. So Mimi, thanks so much. Really for all your incredible work over the years, and thank you very much for your willingness to share it with all of us today. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, so thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Sue. I'm happy to join you. I know that webinars are an imperfect but increasing kind of format that we use to share ideas and have a conversation. I'm also happy that we have, I think, long enough that we will be able to have a little bit of a conversation at the end of this presentation. Thank you so much for joining. I know that just the title itself can be can raise questions, so I just thought I would start by, for those of you who are not familiar with Carceral, and that is many people, that this is a term relating to that part of the government or our society having to do with systems of incarceration, so police, prosecution, jails, prison, probation. That part of our world and that part of our government we refer to as carceral, and might think of that in distinction to the welfare state, which I think people realize right now is a little under attack. So the title is Dancing the Carceral Creep, and you'll get to understand more of what that means to me as we move forward. This is about the feminist anti-violence movement and the pursuit of criminalization. It's a historical talk, but I believe that it has things to tell us about what's going on today. I'm also going to be talking about the anti-domestic violence or the battered women's movement, but a lot of what I say I think has to do with the anti-rape movement. Many of us don't make a distinction between those two. Some of us do, and sometimes that's against our will. So as I move forward, I think we can think of the anti-violence movement in general. And if you see in the first slide, the photograph that I got from the anti-rape movement early on, jail rapists, not victims. I think many of us on this webinar could understand what the feeling might be behind that sign. But if we look at the photo to the right, part of what I want to talk about today, and I think the series talks about, are what some of the implications are for the choices and the strategies that we've chosen early in the movement, but also that we continue today. I say this as somebody who identifies as somebody as part of this movement, who really understands my own evolution in thinking. So I want to join this not as just somebody standing outside and hauling a critique, but as one who stands inside and wants to see how we can have the most relevant and effective and non-harmful social movement that we can have. I think as some of you know in the second slide that we're not only talking about incarceration of men, but we're increasingly seeing incarceration of women and gender nonconforming people. And we might think of another title of this, not just the carceral creep, but why is the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice and not in the Department of Health and Human Services? We can discuss that more later in terms of what that actually means. But I think that some of you know that there was an Office of Violence Against Women that was part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare back in 1979. What happened? This is part of the story that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I want to start with this graph that some of you are very familiar with, but for others this might be the first time you're looking at this. And this is a graph of rates of incarceration in the United States. You can see from this graph that it takes a very definitive shape. And for some people, they have called this moment of this turn in this graph as the punitive turn. The timing of that turn is right around 1973. And from that time on, we can see that the rates of incarceration between 1973 and 2009 jumped by a rate of 500%, or fivefold. If we went back over time, we see that this graph starts around 1945, but if we took it all the way back to about 1920, which is when this data was first collected, we'd actually see a pretty even line going all the way back to 1920, taking this really dramatic turn in 1973. So I think more and more of us are hearing about the high rates of incarceration in the United States. And some people call it mass incarceration, the increase of the carceral state. And part of the disturbing trend is the really dramatic racial disparities in the rates of incarceration. Right now, we can expect that for an African American or Black man in the United States, that there is a 1 in 3 chance that they will be involved in the criminal legal system at some point in their life. That's really, really quite a high ratio. Right now, we see that a Black man or African American man is 6 times more likely than a white man to be incarcerated. If you look at ages between 18 and 20, that rate is 10 times. We also see now that the rates of incarceration for women is rapidly increasing, and in fact is increasing at a rate higher than that of men at the current time. We also see racial disparities among women who are in prison, with Black women 2 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated. Some of you are familiar with these types of graphs, but if we look at the United States, in comparison to OECD nations, that's what this graph shows, you can see how much higher the United States is than any of the other nations. If we had this graph and we added Russia, we'd still be higher, the highest on this graph. And in fact, if we added North Korea's rates are about similar to that of the United States right now. So we're really talking about a phenomenon that is unique to the United States, although one that other nations are catching up with. I just wanted to show this graph too to give you a visual of how women are increasingly incarcerated in the United States, and you can see this dramatic shift right around the same time in the 1970s for women. So going back to the visual that we saw earlier, we see the punitive turn right around 1973, and this great increase in incarceration in the United States. But what was really interesting for me in going back and really looking at the history of our movement, but also the history of mass incarceration in the United States, is the coincidental timing. That we also see the timing of the anti-domestic violence movement or the battered women's movement starting right around the same time in 1973. So I found that this to be rather shocking when I made this comparison. I think that's not to say that we caused this punitive turn, but I think what it does is it gives us an opportunity to think about the relationship between the growth of criminalization in the United States and also the development of a movement that I think for many of us, this webinar, that we feel very a part of and very attached to. So one question that I think that we have for today is, what is the relationship between the buildup of mass incarceration and the development of our anti-violence movement? And my guess is that many of you already been thinking about this question. And another question I want to add, for those of you who took the time to look at a historical period, is how can our understanding of history and the history of our movement help us better understand where we are today? So I hope that we can make those linkages in this webinar. So I want to move on to the research that I did. Again, I've been involved as an advocate and an activist in this movement since the late 1980s. I worked at Asia Michel for 10 years. I had a lot of my own questions coming into this opportunity to actually do some research on a movement, again, that I felt and feel very close to. So my first question that I thought was a paradox was this: how is it that a social movement that is liberatory or emancipatory, the feminist social movement that many of us are part of, how is it that we did come to choose criminalization as our dominant strategy? If we think about it right now, it might look like common sense. Of course we would turn to the criminal justice system, but this was not necessarily true in the early 1970s, when we actually had very little relationship with crime control, and in fact, crime control wanted to have very little relationship with us. So how is it that we chose this as a strategy, and how is it that we chose a part of the government that some might argue is the most masculinist and repressive part of the government? If we think back historically, it's not necessarily common sense that this would have happened. The second question I had was this, and a second paradox, was as many of you know, the anti-violence movement in general, and the battered women's movement in particular, has been really known as a successful social movement. One that was able to take a nation that really had very few crimes that did not necessarily consider domestic violence, let's say, to be a crime, to one in the 1980s where almost every single state had crime legislation linked to domestic violence. There was really a rapid response of society and government to demands made by our early leaders in the movement, many of whom are, I think, on this webinar right now. How is it that we move from this early success to something that might not feel like a domination, but actually a subordination of the criminal justice system today? I think for many of you who have a relationship with the Office of Violence Against Women, for example, we may not necessarily feel like we're on top of the game. We may actually feel like we are subordinated to that system, and yet that was the result of demands that we had made and successfully made with OEW, that would be in 1994 with VAWA. So how is it that we came to this shifting relationship. I also want to show this diagram because this is something that will, I think, become, you'll see it become important in the story that I'm about to tell. And this is something that we don't always think about, but people divide our society into the sphere of civil society and the state. The state being made up of government entities, civil society being made up of things like family, chosen family or biological family. That's maybe where our faith communities are. That is where a lot of our work is done in the nonprofit sector, in the volunteer sector, in our activism that we do. We think of that as part of civil society, and we think of that often as distinct from the state or from the government. If we think in terms of our relationship of social movements to the state, we often think of social movements, including our social movement, as being as really initiated from civil society, not from the government. And we see the government as that entity where we're making demands. We're asking for change. We're asking for legislative change. We're asking for the government to take our demands and our interests seriously. So we see these as generally two distinct, there might be some overlaps, but generally speaking, two distinct spheres of society. When I went back and I did my research in the early years, I found that there were two institutions that started around the same time, both starting in 1980, that I think are really familiar to us today. And I decided to investigate more into how they started, why they started, and what people who started it think about, were thinking at that time, and maybe think about that now. So starting with the Victim Witness Program, some of you know, and some of you may have been part of the start of the Victim Witness Program in 1980 in San Francisco. That was really the first model program of victim witness. As many of you know, victim witness, I think, is a very, very familiar entity we have across jurisdictions at this point, but that was not true in 1980. We saw the start of the first one in San Francisco at that time. On the right, we see another very familiar institution for those of us doing this work, the Community Coordinated Response, or the CCR, that many of you know was started by people in Duluth, who started the Duluth model, also in 1980. So I have these visuals side by side because it's a reminder that before the time that these institutions started, in San Francisco and in Duluth and really across this country, we had really a division between the social movement and law enforcement, between civil society and the state. Most of us had few relations, and a lot of those relationships were, we might describe as contentious at that time. So what happened is social movement leaders in San Francisco and the CCR in Duluth, and you're familiar with many of these early names, they made demands and actually schemed, if we want to call it that, to really engage law enforcement to take domestic violence seriously, to take feminist activists seriously, to take demands for accountability and for the protection of survivors seriously. This was done in two different ways in these two institutions. So if we look at Victim Witness Program, as we know, this was something that was new in that feminists demanded that we actually start by entering into the Hall of Justice. So I call this an embedded system in that social movement leaders and activists said, you know what, we're going to start an institution where we're going to actually go right inside of law enforcement and start a victim witness program that pays attention to survivors of violence and looks out for their interests. So I consider this to be embedded system, and you might recognize the term embedded from thinking about journalists during the really recent times, when journalists covering the Iraq War were no longer had an autonomous relationship, but were really asked that they were only going to be allowed to have relationships as a journalist if they were embedded within military units in Iraq. So this made me think of us being embedded into these police units and prosecution units, starting with the one in San Francisco. We had a different kind of relationship between law enforcement and those people that were activists and advocates in Duluth. And this was more of a coordinated system, which was pretty obvious from the term community coordinated response, right? So we had something where we didn't necessarily have our social movement going right inside of law enforcement. What we had is establish a relationship in which we would have some shared agendas, we would have some shared meetings, we would have some common practices that we would do together, but in a coordinated fashion. So therefore, I have the kind of the visual of that linkage of being different than the embedded system on the left, the victim witness. The thing I found in talking to some of these early leaders was this, that they all saw themselves as having some covert form of feminist control. So on the outside, it looked like a very collaborative relationship, and these were collaborative relationships. But also, another dynamic that seemed very important was that the feminist leaders had a way that they were going to keep control over this relationship with law enforcement. So I'm going to call the one on the left infiltration, because that was the term that was actually used by some of the people that have been talking about this. And they had talked about feeling like they were inside the system, but they were in fact infiltrating inside the system. And in San Francisco, you also had a group of feminists, like more kind of outside agitators or rabble rousers, and law enforcement turned to the partners within the Hall of Justice and turned to them for help to figure out, how do we deal with these people on the outside? Not really necessarily recognizing that the insiders were actually very, very closely linked with the outside agitators. In talking with the early leaders about the community coordinated response, we saw a different way that people, Ellen Pence in particular, talked about keeping some feminist, and I'm calling it feminist direction, over this collaborative community coordinated response. You had a CCR that on the outside looked like a collaboration, perhaps an equal collaboration, but in talking to people, they said that they understood that if you had regular meetings between advocates and law enforcement, who eventually would have the upper hand? I think people understood that if you just had that kind of an unregulated way, that it was very much going to be the tendency that law enforcement would have control. What Ellen Pence and some of the founders did is, when they started this program in Duluth in 1980, was to talk to people that were already running shelters and advocacy, and saying, we're going to come in with this model for a CCR, and we're going to start an organization called, that still exists today, the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project, or the DAIP, that's actually going to be run by feminists, and it's going to have control and direction over the agenda and the meetings and the way that the community coordinated response is going to run. So in fact, while this is a collaboration, there was a way in which the DAIP and the people running the DAIP would actually have some level of feminist control over the way that the CCR in Duluth was going to operate. But what happens with replication? So both of these, the Victim Witness Program in San Francisco and the CCR in Duluth, were started with the intention of being models. think for San Francisco, it was an intention of being a national model. For the CCR, it was the intention of being a statewide model, which then became a national model. But what happens with replication? Do you, if you make a manual, and people did, of the victim witness program or of the CCR, you might say something about the operations and how the coordination was going to happen, collaboration was going to happen. But do you have anything in the model about how you're going to have feminists infiltrate a system? Are you going to have in the manual how feminists will keep covert control over this new institution? I think that most of you can imagine that that wasn't necessarily part of the manual. So when you have replication, the actual dynamics of the relationship between civil society and the state, between social movement and law enforcement was actually subject to a lot of vulnerability and change. And part of what I think happened over time is as these became familiar institutions, not only in Duluth and San Francisco, but in many, many locations throughout the country, we became, the boundaries between civil society and law enforcement, or between advocacy and crime control, became more and more blurry. In some ways, you might call this a hybrid space. These became hybrid spaces in which it was not as easy to tell the boundary between one set and the other. So I'm going to say a little bit, I want to give a couple quotes that I got in collecting these interviews. One is about what happened with the victim witness program. The money was there in criminal justice. However, the fact that victim witness was now becoming part of federal funding was pretty big. Okay, so this is a quote from one of the people that I interviewed. Because that was like soft money. There wasn't a gun in the whole funding package. So this was like softening of law enforcement, which also seemed like a good thing. What happened, I think, was that there was steady pressure to be co-opted by the DAs. Over time, people who are in victim witness were the bottom of the totem pole, particularly in DA's offices, where it's very hierarchical and attorneys are gods. So victim witness was there to serve, and the DAs can hire the people into victim witness, and the ones that they hired, a lot of times they wanted to please the attorneys, you know, the civil servants. They're good law enforcement backers, and they cared about these victims, but they weren't sisters. I'm going to share another quote, and this is related to the CCR. This is from another person that has been active in the movement. And the CCR got picked up and bastardized in different ways. One person picked it up and promoted a prosecutor-led counsel. I don't know why. And another national judicial organization got a huge grant to promote judge-led counsels, which I think are useful. It can really go wrong when you have basically devolved into a council that gets together under the judge, or people pick the structure without picking up the priorities. And if these priorities get lost, you know, it's really the advocacy program's role to keep those front and center. Sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're drowned out or squeezed out. So I think those quotes give you a little sense of perhaps a story that some of you have seen yourselves, of how it is that you can start with a collaboration that feels like something that you demanded, that you won, where you feel like you have power and control over that collaboration. But over time, as things shift and perhaps as things replicate in other areas where similar conditions are not necessarily there, you can easily get into a situation where you're more vulnerable, and in fact, you can be under the control of law enforcement when you first started by feeling like you were in control over them. So I just want to jump ahead a little bit. If we want to use this kind of visual image of the relationship between law enforcement and advocates, we might think about the Family Justice Center today, and what would that picture look like? It might look like, for those of us who are invited into the actual physical geographic space of a family justice center, one-stop shop, that we might find ourselves completely within a building and a system that is, in many cases, run by law enforcement. And we might find ourselves over time, and certainly I think with the vulnerability we feel today, as feeling our spaces and our the kind of space that we occupy within a family justice center as decreasing over time. So why did an emancipatory feminist movement so strongly pursue criminalization? I would say that in looking at the early leaders, they were not seeking collusion, but rather control. And they really strongly felt that they were in a position of control. But how is it that movement success against the criminal justice system may have actually led to its eventual subordination to the same system? That was the second question that I was asking. If we think of this as moving from mechanisms to processes that link over time, we might think of the first step as being contestation, those early years when we actually had little relationship with law enforcement and demanded that law enforcement take some accountability, to a relationship where we had established some sense of collaboration or systems of collaboration with law enforcement, and you see the women's sign indicating that there was some sense of feminist control, a sense of control that was vulnerable to disappearing over time. We see replication of these institutions across jurisdictions across the United States. We see the increasing vulnerability to hybridization, or the loss of the sense of boundary between law enforcement and social movement. As we see these institutions replicate across the United States, we can say that our social movement is increasingly occupied by these kinds of hybrid institutions and relationships. And finally, we find ourselves where we no longer feel in control of law enforcement, but that we actually feel often more subordinated by law enforcement. So if we wanted to call these steps to a dance, we might call this the carceral creep, hence the name. So I want to move back to the conversation we are having and return back to where we've been over the last decades. What we find is that recently there has been more outcry over this incredible turn towards criminalization and how this has taken over our lives, our budgets, our communities, in particular communities of color, immigrant communities, queer communities, communities that have been particularly vulnerable. We have seen a little bit of a downturn in this since about 2009. For example, some of you are aware that Prop 47 passed in California, which is one of the examples of recent legislation or recent policy changes that have tried to reduce this trend. So we see a slight downturn since 2009. So I think one of the questions that I pose to us as we look at the current moment is this: how is it that we can disentangle the relationship between our anti-violence movement and the system of mass incarceration? Is there any kind of reversal that we feel like we can make or moves into a different direction? And another question is, how can our understanding of history and the course that we took, and in some ways we might even say was unwitting, how can our understanding of history now help us to change our present and future course? So I know many of us are thinking about ways that we can change this course, and what are some of the resolutions to the current relationship that we're in with law enforcement and with the state of our nation right now. So very simply, of course, this is a much more complex question, but very simply, how is it that we can start to dismantle our reliance on criminalization? And alternatively, I think one of the things that some of us are turning to is, how can we dismantle that relationship, but how can we build the capacity of our communities to respond at all levels? So I just want to turn to the fact that there are a lot of organizations, and this is by no means a complete list, but there are many organizations right now that have been looking towards trying to build alternatives, trying to build alternative concepts, values, visions, but also alternative practices. How is it that we can actually challenge interpersonal violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, family violence, child abuse, all the kinds of interpersonal community levels of violence that we have? How can we challenge that without necessarily relying on law enforcement? How is it that we can build the capacity that our own organizations and our communities, and including everyday, ordinary members of our communities, join in to be part of the solution? So how is it that all of us can be part of building alternatives? So I'm going to end the actual presentation with that question, in that slide. Here you can see, we will actually have quite a bit of time for questions, but also I wanted to share with you some of the resources that we have. I also want you to know that this is the season of webinars. So I'm going to be giving an upcoming webinar that's going to talk a little bit more about what some of these alternatives have been looking like. In recent times, I know that from being part of the webinar, just being an audience member with Donna Coklers, that I'm sure many of you were part of, that this was a question that many people have as well. So be talking about that more in a future webinar, but I think because we have a lot of time to ask questions, that's something that we can also start to address here today. So I'm just going to leave it open to you as audience members to see what questions that you have. And Sue, I think you're going to facilitate this next section.
Yes, thank you so much, Mimi. That's just such an important and excellent presentation. I also just want to give a heads up to people that we will send out a follow-up message and include live links to the webinar and to the organizations that Mimi lists here. So you don't have to write that down and try to make sure you get all those letters correct, because I know I wouldn't. So we do have a couple questions, and if other people have questions while we're going through the ones that I do have, please put them in the chat box. One of the first questions was, does the research show the same for DV and SA as it does for drug crimes, that more men of color are incarcerated than white people? I'm not sure, Linda, you might want to clarify that. It says than white for these crimes. I
have to say that I'm somewhat familiar, but much less familiar with the statistics regarding substance use. But I think many of us, I think one of the kind of the differential effects of drug laws was very much symbolized in the disparate sentencing of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but crack cocaine being something that was used much more in African American communities, powder cocaine among middle class and wealthier white individuals, and that was just one of the ways in which people realized that drug policy really dramatically targeted communities of color more than they did white communities. And I think if you look statistically, I do not have the statistics on me right now, but certainly it is true that there's a disproportionately large number of people of color that are locked up for drug offenses, and that includes women as well. And I think we can only look at some of the work of Beth Ritchie and other people to see that also some of those drug-related offenses for women are a direct result of their violent relationships that they're part of.
So thank you, but I think her question was actually, are we also seeing that men of color are being disproportionately incarcerated for DV and SA crimes?
Oh, I see. Okay, I went the other way around. I'm sorry, I actually don't have those statistics, and I've been looking for them. The rates of incarceration for domestic violence in particular has been actually some of those, the raw data has been really hard to locate. Well, not hard to locate, but hard to access. So I do not have the hard numbers to back that up, but I would say yes, that's been true. I think the interesting thing is some of the things that we've been trying to, that actually came into play, for example, mandatory arrest, were actually some of the justifications for mandatory arrest were because they thought that it was going to increase the rates of incarceration for white men. And in fact, for example, I think one interesting thing about the Duluth model is one of the first kinds of policies that enacted in 1981 in Duluth was mandatory arrest. And that was because Native American men were so disproportionately targeted for arrest compared to white men. In that, the beginning of that case, it's true that actually the rates of incarceration for white men significantly increased with mandatory arrest. What has happened over time, though, is that you have these great sweeps of people that are arrested using mandatory arrest laws. You see an increasing number of women that have been arrested because somebody needs to be arrested, and people of color. So even though I think it's interesting that some of the early justifications were for exactly the opposite reason, that I think the results over time have been contributing to the rest of men of color, and actually of women of color as well.
Thank you. You mentioned Beth Ritchie earlier, and one of the questions or comments, she said, seeing this, your presentation is making me think of Beth Ritchie's book, Arrested Justice, where she argues that it was white women in the movement in particular who made choices to create relationships with law enforcement, whereas women of color, particularly black women who live in communities riddled with police violence and brutality, did not. And she's wondering about your perspective on this part of the history.
When I was doing these interviews, I really tried to make sure that I had, I think about 25% of the interviews are with people of color. I would say that it's a little bit of a little more nuanced than that. I think that from my understanding and from my research, that that there were women of color that were leaders early in the movement that actually understood, I mean, I think felt really conflicted about it. I think we're not so comfortable to say, yes, let's go for law enforcement. But there were reasons why at least a couple of the people that I talked to felt like they wanted to turn to law enforcement. One was that there was a comparison with the civil rights movement and feeling like Black women in particular who were going and looking for, calling the police, were not getting a response. And so for some, and I'm not going to generalize for all women of color or Black women at all, but there were some that understood or came to understand that demanding a police response and a criminal justice response was somehow also advocating for equal protection, not only of women, but of women of color. Women of color who they viewed were not protected by the police. So there was a way in which I think the thinking from the civil rights movement actually contributed to kind of a justification of this kind of pursuit in the late 1970s, early 1980s, including among women of color. And I also think that women of color at that time were really, really focused in on just getting some representation within anti-violence movements and organizations. That there were very low numbers of women of color, although I want to say that there were some very, very strong leadership among women of color. So I don't want to say this to really insinuate that women of color were voiceless. But I think there was a real move towards looking at inclusion that actually distracted from looking at differences in policy. What I think happened was when it became clear that, you know, as I was saying, and as we know, that criminal justice did start paying attention to domestic violence, and actually, I would say by the 1980s, really took advantage of kind of feminist demand for criminalization as a response to social problems and in, you know, helping to justify this move towards greater criminalization. That's when I think you saw greater unified outcry by women of color that were part of the movement, particularly with the sweep of mandatory arrest. So, for example, in California, when there was a move to pass legislation for mandatory arrest, the Women of Color Caucus in California wrote a letter and said, no, we are opposed to this. We do not think that this is the direction that our movement should take. There was a lot of contestation. There was a lot of fighting. There were a lot of late nights with people saying that we shouldn't go towards crime control earlier on. They tend not to be documented in paper, but recalled in people's memories of some of the early movement days. But I would say, again, that I think the really loud call was when, that was still early on in the, maybe moving towards the mid-1980s. I just also want to take this opportunity to share something that Ellen Pence shared with me, and maybe some of you before she passed. She recalled women of color in Minnesota saying, no, we cannot go this direction. We don't want to lock up our men. And she said, you know, and I have to credit her with admitting this. She said that we considered those women of color who called for this to not be feminists, that they were just trying to protect their men. So there was a way in which they completely dismissed some very early critiques of criminalization. So I guess I just think that I think it's a more complicated answer than one thing to the other. But in reading Beth's book, she also has kind of a simple message, but she also has a very complex story behind that. And I think we should all. I'm not saying that I don't agree with her. I'm just saying that I have seen also some, in talking to different individuals and looking at some of the documents I've seen, I think a kind of a complicated story.
So there's also some discussion now on the chat box, and I want to appreciate people who are sharing just about the difficulty that we have getting good data about convictions for DV-related charges, and talking about how sexual assault crimes also end up, as Chris O'Sullivan was saying, that the attrition rate in sexual assault cases is very high as well. So thank you for sharing that information. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and it's been coming up a lot, and so I really want to ask this question that Judy Chen posed. She thanks you for the webinar, and she says, it sounds like you're not necessarily making the argument that DV, SA arrests have led to the buildup of mass incarceration. No? Rather, are you saying that the problem is that we've become subordinate to a racist mass incarcerating system that harms survivors?
I think for us to say that we caused it is certainly overreach. I think we've contributed to it. So, and in a number of ways. I mean, one, I think some of this was, and again, I think this is a somewhat complicated question, but I think early on we were willing to say, this is an era in which we saw the punitive turn, where we saw really more conservative right-wing forces really, I think, responding to some of the positive moves we made during the civil rights era, and started, coding, using the code of crime to suppress people of color and the movements of people of color. So insofar as we I think over time really started buying into this crime control kind of strategy more and more without any kind of criticism. Now, there was criticism in the early days. There's still criticism now, of course. But there was a time, I think, when there was a very little criticism, moving all the way into the passage of VAWA, when voices were silenced around Violence Against Women Act as being part of the crime bill, when we just want to turn the other way. For those of us, I think, who were really bothered by, not only bothered by, but opposed to increasing criminalization, felt at a loss as to what to say when we ourselves wanted a crime bill passed, when we ourselves were really fighting for changes on enhanced sentencing and so on, locally or on the state level, that I think it really actually prevented us from having any kind of serious critique of the buildup of mass incarceration. So I don't want to say that we were the direct cause, but I do want to say that I think we contributed to it. I think that our ties to this kind of logic of crime control prevented us from being really opposed in a way that I think that feminists who do not believe in violence should be. And I think that we really need to question that and break away from the kind of reasoning that would make it so difficult for us to really be against the really great shift that has happened in this nation. So, there's more I'd say to that, but I feel that pretty strongly. And I feel that as somebody who's been a part of the movement and found myself also having difficulty with that, and knowing that something was very wrong.
So I'm just saying, someone's typing in a question now. Like I said, there's a lot of questions about getting data about DV-related charges and the difficulties of it. So, it's something that I know people are really looking into these days. So I hope at some point we can get some of that data. So I guess, this is going to shift us a little bit, but maybe we can do that now, which is, Can you talk about examples of alternatives to incarceration that will hold perpetrators of intimate partner violence accountable while enhancing victim safety? And then she adds, or will that be covered in a future webinar? Given that we do have some time, do you want to spend a little bit of time talking about that now, Mimi, or do you? Okay.
Sure. I mean, there's so much to be said. So I think that even in a future webinar, I mean, I've done, 2 whole days on this. We don't get through everything. But, and I do want to actually turn back a little bit. I think in terms of people who have access to that data around arrests and incarceration, please do the work. I mean, that, in fact, if we can do anything together to try to pursue that, I think that'd be great. It has been hard when I have tried to pursue some of that data. Very true. But going back to, if we want to move towards alternatives, I think I wanted to say that we're in this conversation together right now. I think the fact that we even have this opportunity now is through this webinar and the project that Sue Ostoff and our friends at the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women are taking on. Many of us on this call have been part of these conversations locally. And I think these are alternatives that we have to construct together, and we are very much in the position of taking a prominent role in that because we really understand the complex dynamics of domestic violence and sexual assault. We understand the private nature of so much of that harm. We understand the very nuanced way in which power and control is exercised. We understand the lethality. We also understand how damaging emotional violence can be, things that aren't even considered crimes, right? So we are in a very good position to do that. I would say that, and I probably will talk, I will talk about this more in another webinar, but one of the things that I and some of my colleagues undertook with the start of creative interventions was really trying to see what those interventions would look like. That we had a critique of the directions in which the anti-violence movement had gone. We also had an openness for really looking at some alternatives. And so we started with some basic values and principles that we were going to hold within our organization. And that was that we knew that people have access to law enforcement through other advocacy centers, so that was not something that we were going to offer. That we were really going to look towards how is it that people's real first responders, which is friends, families, and community members, can come up with an intervention to violence that would promote safety for survivors, but would also hold people who have caused harm accountable. And we were really at a beginning point, and I think we still are. So I know that people are looking for, give me a very definitive model and examples. I think we're moving towards being able to do that, but right now they tend to be stories. For example, we have a website called stopviolenceeveryday.org with our storytelling and organizing project with really simple but valiant stories from individuals who have gotten together as friends and family and done something to intervene in violence, to provide some kind of safety for survivors, but really just to respond in ways that made sense for that family, for that community, and didn't necessarily follow something that we, really have a menu of options right now, right? We have a restraining order, call the police, legal separation, divorce, and so on. We have a menu. So our model was really in kind of moving the site of intervention away from even services, but towards really supporting families and friends and community members to come up with interventions that made sense for them. Now that is something that we haven't been doing as an anti-violence movement. In fact, we've been really discouraging and saying, don't do that. too dangerous, leave it in our hands, or call the police. So I would say that we're beginning to make that shift, that we've had 40 years of all of our attention going to the way we do services now. And so we're beginning to construct, I think, new values and models to do that. And what I think I'll do later is really share some of those. I'm not going to do that today because I'm not prepared to and we don't have time, but share some of those stories of things that we did. Maybe I can share something briefly, but I also want to say that I know a lot of you are also hearing about restorative justice as a possible way to go towards providing safety and accountability. Now, I think many of you understand that in the United States and actually internationally, there has been a real hesitation to use restorative justice circles and processes for domestic violence and sexual assault. Much of this has been because of our own opposition to this use, I think for many good reasons, and that there have been some limited examples of the ways in which restorative justice processes have been used, I think primarily in indigenous communities, but also in some others in the United States and Canada, in New Zealand. So we're starting to learn from those. I think there's been because there's been this increasing critique, and I think along with that, an increasing openness for us to try things that we considered simply taboo before, that we are going to start seeing some examples of ways in which this is being used, let's say restorative justice on college campuses towards sexual assault. We're starting to see some campuses begin to start some processes that, and collective groups under, for example, PRISM, that have been looking to see how these have worked well and how they have not. We are starting to, we're going to be doing something in California where we're going to do more intensive training on how to use restorative practices for domestic violence and sexual assault, and looking more specifically on the different ways in which you need to prepare survivors and family members and friends to actually be involved in a circle. Does a circle even make sense? Under what conditions? How would survivors and allies be prepared? And how would the person who did harm, what kind of criteria would we need for somebody who had done harm to actually get involved? So there's another initiative, I think that's going to be starting in New York. Some of the people that first started some of these processes, Gail Burford and, I'm very, very sorry that I'm forgetting your name right now. Joan Pennell, yes. Joan Pennell. Sorry, Joan, if you're on here. Joan, they've been really early leaders starting in the mid-1990s and are finally getting the time now when people actually are saying, what did you do? And that people are really willing to start this. So I know different states have been, different organizations in different states are providing much more supportive context in which those of us, I think, who have been really working in the anti-violence movement can bring our expertise and our experiences and our fears into these new practices where we will look at ways in which not only law enforcement can hold people accountable, but that we actually use people who care about them, that already know them, that have some understanding of their values, that have compassion towards them, to be people who can form better systems of accountability. I feel hopeful about some actually melding of some of the work that we've been sponsoring more through creative interventions, which really is not a one-size-fits-all. It's very much, you could be dealing with something that's happening, you know, next door immediately to something that happened 20 years ago. It's very much an approach that's what's needed now, who can we get together right now who would actually be positive resources in intervening in violence? How do we actually better think about what our goals are? And how do we actually form some kind of a system of accountability that understands that people who cause harm, generally speaking, are not readily accountable? That we understand that that's to be expected. And for somebody to not show accountability right away is not necessarily a sign of failure or that this wouldn't work, but rather something that we have to build around. So I know that answer is not as satisfying as some people would want, that you don't want real concrete right now. There are more concrete responses of different programs that I had tried. For example, kind of a surrogate program in Eugene, Oregon, a program like Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective that is not a 501c3 but has been providing kind of ongoing support for people who want to challenge or do something about child sexual abuse and other forms of violence. I am not at liberty to share a lot of the situations that we dealt with at Creative Interventions, except those that made it through our storytelling project, but I'll just give an example of ways in which people try to decrease lethality with a violent situation where somebody had a gun. And so that intervention was primarily around engaging that person to see that it was in his interest to have that gun taken away, and having the community come together and come up with a response to really reduce the lethality of that situation. So those are just kind of partial examples, and but I hope that somewhat answered your question, and you might have more questions raised from that response I just gave.
Oh, that was a really great summary, actually, Mimi. So I'm really impressed you were able to do that so quickly. So, and yes, I mean, and Dot mentioned that in the chat that she will be sending out a live link to Mimi's upcoming webinar on June 28th so that you can register for that. And we also were talking to some other people as well about the possibility of doing additional webinars on different restorative and transformative justice approaches to domestic violence and sexual assault. I also just want to note that the Office on Violence Against Women did fund the Center for Court Innovation to collect information about different restorative and transformative justice programs around the country that are addressing domestic and sexual violence, and so hopefully that will be available relatively soon. So we're staying in touch with them to find out what they're finding out. So if we can share that back, we certainly will do that. So
yeah. And I guess I just also want to say I think there's certain state coalitions right now that are really actively looking at ways in which they can support, a kind of a different kind of environment within the state where it is going to be easier for organizations that are interested in these differences to alternatives, and also changes in policy that rely less on criminalization or actually dismantle criminalization. I think this is happening. Some of you are on this call: Washington State, Iowa State, Virginia, California. I know there are other states that are, I believe Arizona. I think there's quite a few right now that are really trying to be thoughtful about this, bold about this process, but thoughtful about how it's carried out, thinking about how we might support pilot programs. I know that Iowa's already been piloting programs that are based on the work that we did at Creative Interventions, at this moment. So there, we will have more stories to share of the ways in which our organizations made a shift from the way that we do things to expanding to different options, maybe even growing new types of organizations that can actually carry out community-based responses. I also work a lot with social justice organizations that don't consider themselves part of the domestic violence or sexual assault community, but that are continuously facing, obviously, like any community, are facing sexual violence and domestic violence, but are also opposed to calling the police and are starting to get very serious about offering responses. So that's another a kind of a parallel set of actions that's happening right now. I think that the crossover between social justice organizations and our organizations shouldn't be such a divide, but I would say that I think there has been a real divide that's developed over time. And what I'm hoping is that this can help us make bridges.
So I want to put these two questions together, one from Allison and one from Judy. Judy, I did see your question. Allison says, when I talk to individual women of color, they seem to universally be saying they want a stronger law enforcement response to the crimes committed against them. And then she asked, how does that jive with reducing our involvement with the criminal justice system? And Judy followed up and said, could you, Mimi, speak to under-policing in communities of color?
Okay, so those are linked questions. I guess you're saying that you have a universal experience of hearing that I don't think that is universal. I mean, I don't want to take away from what you're saying, and I agree, and I think that's partly what I was reflecting even in the early years. There's a way in which I think because there is for so many people, when they do call the police, there's a lack of response that some of us may be saying, well, why are we asking for less crime control? We should be asking for more. But I would say that having that answer go from A to B is a problem. And part of what I wanted to describe in kind of the historical story I gave before was that there are these contradictions that happen, and that we can make demands for certain things in part because we can't imagine what else would be there. So if all you can imagine is a 24/7 response that would be from law enforcement, and you can't imagine that you would have any kind of community response that would be effective, then yes, you're going to only call for the law enforcement response. There is a way in which we have become so habituated also to think that our answer to a problem is to call the police. I mean, one of the problems that happens in communities of color is that because there's less and less any other kind of government response, you can't, I mean, welfare actually, we don't need to say much about how welfare is under attack right now, but for a long time, our welfare system has been a punitive one. So it's not necessarily one that people wanted to turn to. Have they been able to turn to any kind of parks and rec system that used to be quite active, library system that used to be active? We used to have many more kind of social responses from government that would have met a lot of different needs. Now, that might not have met violence, but there are ways in which these types of, kind of rich community resources actually reduce violence. They lead to a healthier civic life. They lead to better neighborhood relations, and that we have become accustomed over time to be. This is what happens in the system of mass incarceration: is that we can only imagine that the police are going to be an answer. We can't imagine anything else, and we're mad when the police don't come. So I would say that I think if people actually could even imagine something that was a different response, and if we could actually provide that different response because we've built up our resources, our muscle, our skills, our kind of imagination to actually be able to provide that, I really think that people are going to want a different response than law enforcement. That's just basically, for some communities of color, that's the law enforcement has become the new place where you're going to go and get housing and food. I mean, if you want to be so crude about it. So I really want us to kind of question the context in which somebody would only think of that as a demand.
So another question. With increasing interest from the state and state coalitions collaborating with the state, do you see any potential for state co-optation of restorative justice models? And how can we avoid that?
Yes, I really can. So thank you for that question. I think that part of, I have to say that this research project was eye-opening to me. That I think it became clear to me how important it is for us to keep autonomous spaces. So while I myself believe that if there is a restorative justice pilot or something that happens with law enforcement, because that's probably, I have no doubt we're going to see that we have to think about the ways in which their learnings, their findings, their responses can then be used to feed those of us who are going to keep ourselves autonomous from the system. I think we have to keep a healthy autonomy from the system. That doesn't mean that every single one of us, has to completely divest in the criminal justice system. But it does mean that some of us need to, or that some part of us needs to, and it has to really hold that ground. So I really push for what, I didn't use the words transformative justice before, but I do now. I push for transformative justice as a kind of a vision in a practice of alternatives that does not rely at all on the criminal justice system, because I think we have to keep that alive. That is too easy to lose that, and if we lose that, we are going to be co-opted. We have to keep that alive, and even if we do things at times that are in some kind of collaboration with law enforcement, that our understanding is that we cannot do that as an end, but that is a means towards something that is going to survive within communities, particularly those communities that are most vulnerable, with or without a law enforcement response. So, and I don't think I need to make this so clear right now. We see in immigrant communities right now a sharp decrease, at least in California, of immigrant survivors, whether documented or undocumented, of calling the police right now for a response to violence. What are we doing for them? We really, really need to build up skills, resources, and actual spaces and options for people that are separated from law enforcement. And I wish this were a two-way conversation, because I know so many of you have really wonderful things to say, and
someone actually just posted a comment about immigrant communities in the chat right when you were saying that, so you were right on, for sure. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to all of these questions at this point. It's a little unclear exactly which one are comments and which one are questions. And Mimi, like I said, we will share this chat with you because it's very rich. But I did want to just follow up on that question about avoiding co-optation, because I just think your whole analysis through your presentation is just so interesting. And part of my question is thinking about that whole process, from mechanisms to processes, and then talking about replication. And I loved your comment about, people didn't write in the manuals about what the covert feminist agenda was, and the importance of making sure that feminist leadership was built in both inside and outside in places that were doing it. Are there lessons to be learned for where we are now based on what you said? Is there something inevitable about this process, or is there a way of intervening so that it does not happen in the way that it happened in the past in our movement?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope there's something that can be learned. I think so, from myself, and I have to say that I've been asked to share this analysis more and more. I was a little bit nervous about doing this at first with my own community of people that have been working on this issue so long, but I think that there's a way in which this particular analysis, and there's many ways to slice analysis. This is one perspective, but I think there's a way in which it's made sense for people, that they can understand how you would be so you would be so happy and feel so victorious that you had actually won something that brings the attention of the state or the government, or in this case law enforcement, that you just happily ran down that road. There were people that warned against it, and I have to say that part of this is a warning against this right now. That if we think that we can have control over the process of the way that we get make demands and get intertwined with government, I think what we've seen over time is that we have been subordinated. And so I really think that we have to be really cognizant of this and really ask ourselves, why would this be any different now than it was before? Now, if there are different conditions, let's talk about it. But I'm not sure if there are sufficient conditions that are different. But right now, this is being funded by OVW. So clearly, I'm talking to you, and we're doing this under the DOJ. So I understand that in this, this very activity that we're involved in today is taking place under the auspices, if you want to call it, the resources of the Department of Justice. How are we going? So one, I want to be transparent about that. Now that that's been raised, how do we then use this opportunity to actually then not, to set our gaze outside of OVW and outside of the criminal justice system, to understand that our accountability, our true accountability, is to communities, and to the most vulnerable communities, those that have been targeted by law enforcement. So yes, I'm taking place, this is perhaps contradictory, but I think I'm understanding that I'm doing this webinar under the auspices of OVW, but I keep in mind where my true accountability is and where most of my resources and my activities are going to aim towards. And I think many people in this call are caught up in that same contradiction, that you're under the funding of OVW, that you're not in the position to be so purist that you're going to say that you're totally outside. And few of us are. We get money from foundations that are also, have their own contradictions. And yet I think there has to be a way in which we keep our practices and keep our accountability and keep our networking with people, keeping in mind that we, one, need to dismantle our reliance on criminalization, and two, that we need to build the capacity of everyday vulnerable communities to actually intervene in violence, and that includes intervening violence that's perpetrated by the state.
Thank you, Mimi. It's really been just incredible, and you'll see people are really jazzed up about how you're getting them to think and how much you're helping them in their home state. So thank you so much. Dot, could you just post again the link to the Google Drive, just so people have that, so they know that an article that Mimi wrote and was published in 2015 on dancing the carceral creep is available there, as is a copy of the webinar, of the PowerPoint that was that she used in the webinar here, so that you can copy that and keep that, because I think it's just going to be very valuable. And just asked about the chat being available to the participants. Dot, are we able to do that? We can post it on the Google Drive. I just want to make sure that everybody who chatted actually is okay with that. So I'm going to assume that we can do that. So yes, we can make that available. So Mimi, it's really just been worth the wait. I have been trying for quite some time to get Mimi to do this webinar for us and for you all. And so Mimi, thank you so much for doing it. It's just terrific.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining, everybody. I'm sorry I was told I could not look at the chat. I wish I could, but I will definitely look at your questions, and I look forward to our continued conversation. We're all in this together.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of you who participated. on the chat quite vigorously, and so thank you all. Talk to you next week, actually. There's another one. So we'll also send out information with about the upcoming webinar that's next Wednesday, but we'll send out information about how you can get the recordings of our past webinars in this series in the last couple of weeks. So thank you, Mimi.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.